The successful aristocratic strike against monarchy had made the city revert to a state of loose confederations of clans, a society dominated by religious nobility, ruling as local chiefs over their yens. However, revolutions inside these clans, families, and tribes transformed the yens into a much less powerful entity by putting an end to its indivisibility, by abolishing the concentration of property rights of the senior branch, and by depriving the clan from its manpower and workforce through the emancipation of clients. Two social classes were left, the privileged class of patricians and everyone else, the common folk, known as plebs. This distribution of power and civil rights based on the possession or lack thereof of a specific ancestry would come into question, and those who were oppressed by it would not stop fighting against such a system. A new revolutionary wave would start, and it would be an open, civil confrontation provoked by the ever-growing ascension of the plebs. In this new revolution, the plebeians would eventually, through force and social consensus, acquire citizenship, equality before the law, and access to the possibility of becoming magistrates and consuls. They would first penetrate this patrician city, and then they would dominate it by changing its founding principles and destroying its religious constitution for good. These changes ended with the religious nobility's monopoly on power, and in the process gave way to new political systems like direct democracy, republican democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, which sought preeminence in a new dialectical shock. This revolution was made possible by changes which eroded the existing institutions thanks to several demographic and cultural pressures. Amongst the changes leading to these plebeian revolutions were the military reorganization of the cities, the expansion of trade, the appearance of key figures such as lawgivers and reformers to mediate in the class conflict, religious appropriation of the patrician religion, and the weakening of the yens. All of this paved the way for the rise of the plebeian class and its domination of economic, military, legal, religious, and political grounds. This resembles in a very similar way the rise of the bourgeoisie as a social class in the modern era, and the 19th century bourgeois revolutions, starting from the 1789 uprising, which destroyed the Ancien Regime in France and most of Europe, which was based on the social order of feudalism and the political system of absolute monarchy, and opened the way for new systems to appear. Liberal democracy then began to compete with other forms of tyranny in what has become the modern Western dialectic. We will do a future video regarding this, but for now, let's go back to the ancient West. The previous revolution had weakened the aristocratic yens beyond repair. By extinguishing the monopoly of the senior branch and freeing the clients, the city-state was no longer a loose federation of families acting like small states, in which people were distributed amongst them. But it started to look like a union of individuals, brewing a confrontation between patricians, who mostly wanted to maintain the religious constitution of the city and the government, and the privileges of being the ruling class, against the plebeians, who wanted to tear those privileges and constitution down. Now, the early plebs didn't have much social organization whatsoever, or any religious tradition which could dispute the legitimacy of the patrician religion. Plebs wouldn't begin to form a strong opposition to the nobility until they could produce their own leaders, representing their interests. Before becoming a formidable social class in terms of economic power and cultural transcendence, plebs would show support to the monarchic system to make a counterweight to the nobility. This first round, as we've seen, ended in a victory of the aristocracy. However, after the collapse of political monarchy in most Greek and Italian cities, and especially from the 6th century onwards, and especially in Greece, plebeians increasingly attempted to resist aristocratic rule by promoting a restoration of kingship, instead calling these new rulers tyrants, from the Greek word tyrannos, which can be roughly understood as a despot, usurper, illegitimate ruler, or degenerate monarch, depending on who you read. But most authors agree on a term that implies someone who wielded monarchical power but lacked the constitutional legitimacy previously held by kings. They were called tyrants and not kings because they lacked the religious significance of the kingly title, since these tyrants came to power only by savvy and unconstitutional political action and were maintained in it either by popular support of the lower classes or simply by brute force, in contradiction to the republican rule of law. The appearance of tyranny as a form of government was an innovation with tremendous, and I do mean tremendous, implications for the Western civilization, some of which we are still living to this very day. This, initially, was because tyrants derived their power from other men. This was the birth of the concept of power being a contract to rule given purely to humans by humans, and not by a divine abstraction who appointed them. Eventually, the phenomenon of tyranny became widespread and there came to be tyrants all over the Greek world, in, for example, Cumas, Crotona, Syracuse, Miletus, Argos, Megara, and Samos, and in Rome, with tyrants like Poplicola, Manlius, Espurius, and Cassius, who were put by the common people not because of love for tyranny itself as a system, but because tyranny, at least before the appearance of a more sophisticated form of rule of law, proved to be the most efficient way of resistance of the plebeians against the perceived excesses of religious aristocratic rule. Those in favor of popular rule against their nobility came to be known as the Popular Party, opposed to the aristocratic party. So, tyranny was a way for the still disorganized plebeians to institute a counterweight to the power of the nobility, and thus to advance their interests. However, tyranny was only a first, imperfect kind of desperate manifestation of the pursuit of what plebeians truly wanted and needed: equality before the law and ending the privileges of birth. So how do we get from an aristocratic system of castes to a popular tyranny, and then to a more sophisticated republican system of rule of law? Previously, the Gens had been a self-sufficient economic entity, with minimal trade with the outside world, and practically needing no currency. This is especially evident from the scarcity of records, amphorae, and coinage we have from the Dark Ages, when comparing it with the previous Bronze Age and the subsequent Archaic and Classical periods. The Greek Dark Ages are usually associated with the high time of aristocratic rule, but from the 6th century onwards, demographic and economic growth accelerated dramatically in the Mediterranean. A new taste for art and luxury goods, previously inexistent, boomed, and gradually, trade, as opposed to only agriculture, became a main source of wealth. Currency, in the form of money, particularly in the form of metal coinage, appeared. The old domestic religion had no grip over currency and trade as it had with land. Remember again the god of property, Terminus, who watched over the estates of a family. Well, it lost relevance as the economic reality was changed. Most of the lands remained in the hands of the nobility, but the affairs of trade and artisan industry mostly belonged to the plebs. In time, many plebeians got rich, sometimes even richer than the landowning nobility in some sort of le bourgeois gentilhomme social paradox. What does privilege mean without relative wealth? This happened because the economic structure of the ancient world moved from an essentially agrarian, autarkic economy to a still agrarian-based, but more open and integrated economy, with industry and trade having a more relevant space in production. This economic transformation allowed plebs to become an organized class because it gave them a hierarchy determined by wealth and obtained through a freer trade system. This natural process of hierarchization, brought upon by the results of economic activity, made it possible for a plebeian aristocracy to rise and lead as a party. This new plebeian aristocracy withdrew their support for tyrants in pursuit for more beneficial forms of government, which allowed the protection of the interests of these plebeian elite, who made of free enterprise their source of wealth and power. The dialectic of religious aristocracy opposed to tyrants and kings was no more, and new political systems were born from new constitutional resources, such as the domination of a wealth aristocracy, also known as oligarchy, and the experiment of democracy. Militarily, cavalry had been the great symbol of aristocratic power, to the point of being able to refer to noblemen in Latin as equites, he who rides a horse, which is synonymous to the Greek word hippis, and seen later in the medieval period with the French chevalier, the Spanish caballero, and the English knight. However, as infantry gained more importance in battle, particularly during and after the Persian Wars, so did plebeians as a class, because they formed the bulk of these infantry units, called phalanx. The same happened with the ever-growing importance of the navy, which mostly consisted of plebeian crews, as trade and seafaring expanded in Greece. It's often cited that Athenian democracy was first founded in the ships of Athens as a plebeian innovation. Plebs eventually came to dominate the arms, as they had done with industry and trade, and with this, they broke the aristocratic monopoly in the military, as they had done with economic power. Because the early city-state had a religious constitution, plebeians would also strive to obtain some sort of religion which resembled the patrician cult. In this struggle, they would make every effort to imitate the exclusive patrician religion by erecting public vestas dedicated to their new associations. They would have their own priests and would assimilate some Eastern Hellenistic cults which proclaim no distinctions between classes marked by ancestry. Or, it was also the case, some popular party leaders like lawmakers, kings and tyrants simply assigned gods for every quarter or street. This is what Cleisthenes did in Athens and King Servius in Rome. We'll go back to Cleisthenes later. Through a diversity of ways, the plebeians acquired a religion that resembled very closely the patrician tradition, with the ascendancy of the plebs on the way, and the nobility losing ground with the decline of its primordial institutions. The advancement of ideas made the city-state a fruit ripe for the taking, and the plebs were on the move. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We will receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.